The jacket was folded across the elderly man's empty bed, but the dark stain on its sleeve was not mine, and neither was the trembling handwritten note pinned above the pocket. By the time I finished reading the first sentence, my knees had weakened, my anger had vanished, and I understood that the neighbor I had accused of stealing from me had been quietly carrying a burden that could destroy what remained of his life. Before I tell you what happened, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because sometimes the smallest act of compassion reaches farther than we will ever know. My name is Everett Hayes, and 3 years ago I believed I understood loneliness. I lived alone in a narrow brick apartment building in Cedar Falls, Iowa, worked from home repairing insurance databases, and measured my days by deadlines, microwave dinners, and the sound of other people's lives passing through the hallway. Across from me lived an 81-year-old widower named Hollis Whitmore. He was a thin, careful man with silver hair, heavy glasses, and a slight limp that became worse whenever the weather turned cold. He wore pressed shirts even to collect his mail, greeted everyone by name, and spent most afternoons sitting beside his window with a cup of tea he rarely seemed to drink. We exchanged polite greetings for nearly a year, but I never entered his apartment, and he never entered mine. I told myself that respecting his privacy was kindness. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I had become skilled at keeping people far enough away that they could not disappoint me. On a bitter January morning, Hollis knocked on my door while pale sunlight reflected from the snow outside. His furnace had stopped working, and the maintenance company could not send anyone until later that afternoon. He tried to make the problem sound small, but his hands were shaking, and his lips had lost their color. I invited him inside, made coffee, and offered him my warmest jacket because he insisted on walking to the pharmacy before the sidewalks became worse. It was a charcoal wool coat my late father had given me shortly before his death. I had worn it to his funeral, carried it through 2 moves, and treated it like one of the few remaining pieces of a relationship that had ended before either of us learned how to repair it. Hollis understood that it mattered to me. He carefully buttoned it, promised to return it before supper, and stepped into the bright winter morning. He did not return that afternoon. He did not return the next day. When I knocked, there was no answer. At first, I worried he had fallen, but the building manager said Hollis had been seen leaving with a small suitcase. No one knew where he had gone. His telephone rang without answer, his curtains remained closed, and my jacket vanished with him. My concern slowly hardened into resentment. I checked hospitals, called the police non-emergency line, and left notes beneath his door. Nothing. A week became 2, then a month. The building manager finally admitted that Hollis had paid his rent in advance and left no forwarding address. I felt foolish for caring and even more foolish for lending him the jacket. The coat was replaceable, but I could not separate it from my father's memory. My father, Franklin, had been a proud, distant man who believed emotions were weaknesses best hidden behind work. During the last year of his life, we argued over nearly everything. Our final conversation ended with me accusing him of caring more about being right than being close to his only son. He died unexpectedly 2 days later. The jacket had become my punishment and my comfort, proof that I could still hold something he had touched even though I could never apologize. Each time I passed Hollis' silent apartment, I imagined him selling it, losing it, or leaving it on the back of a bus. The imagined betrayal gave me somewhere to place the anger I had carried since my father's death. Nearly 3 months later, on a clear April morning, I saw Hollis entering the building. He looked smaller than I remembered. His cheeks were hollow, one hand gripped a cane, and the other held a paper hospital bag. I hurried toward him, expecting relief, but the first words out of my mouth were about the jacket. His expression folded with pain. He apologized and said the coat was safe, but he needed 1 more day. That answer infuriated me. I reminded him that it belonged to my father and accused him of taking advantage of my trust. Hollis lowered his eyes as other tenants slowed to listen. He quietly promised that I would understand soon, but I told him there was nothing to understand. I demanded the jacket by noon the following day and walked away before he could respond. For the rest of that afternoon, I replayed the confrontation and justified every word. Yet beneath my anger was the uncomfortable memory of his exhausted face and the way his hand had tightened around the hospital bag. I could have knocked on his door and asked whether he was ill. I could have offered to carry his things. Instead, I waited for an apology that would make my pain feel important. The following morning, an ambulance arrived shortly after sunrise. I watched through my window as paramedics carried Hollis from the building. He was conscious but pale, an oxygen mask covering part of his face. His eyes turned toward my window, and for one brief second, I was certain he saw me. I remained behind the curtain. An hour later, the building manager gave me a key and explained that Hollis had requested that I enter his apartment if he was taken to the hospital. My jacket, she said, was waiting in the bedroom. I crossed the hallway feeling victorious and ashamed at the same time. Hollis' apartment smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and old paper. Framed photographs covered the walls, Hollis beside a smiling woman with red hair, Hollis holding a baby girl, Hollis standing outside a hardware store, Hollis much younger in an army uniform. The rooms were tidy except for the dining table, which was covered with medical bills, medication bottles, and unopened letters stamped final notice. Beside them sat an envelope containing a pawnshop receipt. The item listed was a gold wedding ring. Hollis had sold the last visible reminder of his wife, yet my coat was not there. I found the jacket in the bedroom, folded neatly across the bed. One sleeve carried a dark brown stain, and a handwritten note was pinned above the pocket. Hollis wrote that he was deeply sorry for keeping it and even sorrier for allowing me to believe he had forgotten its meaning. On the morning I lent him the coat, he had gone to the pharmacy to collect medication but saw a young woman collapse near the bus stop. She was pregnant, frightened, and bleeding. Hollis wrapped my jacket around her, called an ambulance, and rode with her to the hospital because she had no family nearby. During the emergency, blood stained the sleeve. The woman's name was Maren Caldwell, and doctors delivered her baby early. Hollis remained at the hospital because Maren's husband, a soldier stationed overseas, could not return immediately. Maren had recently moved to Cedar Falls and knew no one. Hollis told her that no person should face terror alone while daylight still offered another hour to help. He intended to return the coat after having it professionally cleaned, but before he could come home, doctors discovered that his persistent cough and weakness were caused by advanced lung disease. He had been transferred to a specialist clinic in another city, where treatment consumed his savings and strength. The note continued, explaining why he had returned without giving me the jacket. The cleaning company had been unable to remove the stain without damaging the wool. Hollis knew how much the coat meant to me, so he spent weeks searching for a tailor who could replace the sleeve with matching vintage fabric. He sold his wife's wedding ring to pay for the repair after medical bills emptied his account. The tailor had returned the coat only the previous afternoon. Hollis planned to explain everything to me over coffee, but my anger convinced him that perhaps an explanation would sound like an excuse. Beneath the note was a small photograph of Maren holding a tiny baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the back, she had written that Hollis saved 2 lives that morning because his calm presence kept her from giving up. She also wrote that the warm coat he placed around her became the first safe thing she remembered after collapsing. My hands shook as I turned toward the jacket. The repaired sleeve was nearly perfect. Inside the pocket, I found another object, my father's old brass keychain, which I thought I had lost years earlier. It must have been trapped beneath the torn lining. Hollis had found it and stitched a small protective pocket around it. I went to the hospital immediately. Hollis was awake in a bright room overlooking a courtyard where daffodils leaned toward the morning sun. Machines clicked beside his bed, but his eyes were clear. I sat near him and struggled to speak. For years, I had imagined apologizing to my father, rehearsing words that could never reach him. Now I faced another elderly man I had wounded with the same pride I once condemned. I told Hollis that I had entered his apartment, read the note, and learned what he had done. I admitted that I had cared more about recovering an object than understanding the human being standing before me. Hollis did not make me beg for forgiveness. He simply placed his thin hand over mine. He explained that grief often disguises itself as anger because anger feels stronger. He had recognized that pain in me because he had carried it after his wife, Adeline, died. For nearly a decade, he blamed doctors, relatives, himself, and even the weather on the morning of her death. Eventually he understood that love could not survive as a locked room filled only with memories. It had to be given away, especially when giving it hurt. Hollis remained hospitalized for 2 weeks. I visited every day, rearranged my work schedule, paid the overdue balance on his apartment, and contacted Marin through the telephone number in his note. She arrived from a nearby town with her infant daughter, Felicity, on a bright Thursday afternoon. The moment Hollis saw the child, his entire face changed. Marin placed Felicity carefully in his arms, and the old man wept without embarrassment. She told me how he had stayed beside her through emergency surgery, how he spoke gently whenever fear overwhelmed her, and how he returned during his own treatment to make certain she was recovering. Marin had offered to replace the jacket, but Hollis refused because he understood that some belongings cannot be measured by price. Standing beside his hospital bed, I realized my father's coat had become more meaningful, not less. It no longer represented only regret. It had carried a frightened woman through a medical crisis, warmed a premature baby, revealed Hollis' hidden sacrifice, and brought 3 lonely people into the same room. When Hollis was discharged, he could no longer live entirely alone. I surprised myself by asking him to move into my larger apartment across the hall while we arranged long-term care. What began as a temporary solution became a new kind of family. Hollis taught me how to repair loose chair joints, make proper tea, and recognize the difference between silence that feels peaceful and silence that asks to be broken. Marin visited often with Felicity, and when her husband returned from deployment, he embraced Hollis like a father. I began volunteering at a community program that paired isolated seniors with local residents. At first, I told myself I was doing it for Hollis, but I soon understood I was doing it for myself as well. Listening to people's stories softened parts of me that grief had made rigid. I called old friends I had ignored, apologized to my mother for disappearing into my own sorrow, and placed my father's brass keychain on my desk instead of hiding it in a drawer. I could not change our final conversation, but I could decide whether regret would make me colder or more compassionate. Hollis lived for another 11 months, far longer than his doctors expected. He spent those months surrounded by people who had once been strangers. On his final morning, sunlight filled the room while Marin read beside the window and Felicity slept against my chest. Hollis looked at the charcoal jacket hanging near the door and smiled. He told me that objects do not keep people alive, the love we attach to them does. After he passed peacefully that afternoon, I wore the jacket to his memorial service. I did not hide the faint stain that remained beneath the repaired sleeve. I finally understood that the mark was not damage. It was evidence that something precious had been used to protect someone more precious. Before the service ended, I placed Adeline's recovered wedding ring beside Hollis' photograph. Marin and I had found the pawn shop and bought it back together. If this story has stirred something in you, please leave a meaningful comment about a time when learning someone's hidden struggle changed the way you judged them. Your words may remind another person to pause, listen, and choose compassion before anger. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. I once believed my elderly neighbor had stolen the last important thing my father left me. What I discovered was that Hollis had taken nothing. He had returned the jacket carrying a greater inheritance than my father could have placed inside any pocket: the courage to forgive, the humility to look beyond appearances, and the understanding that love becomes most valuable when we allow it to serve someone else. The coat still hangs near my front door, and every time I wear it into the daylight, I remember 2 elderly men, one I could no longer apologize to, and one who taught me how to live that apology for the rest of my life.